guys, this is Abhimanyu from AP Deconstructed. Today we have a new AP Biology video. In this video, we will cover the second unit of AP Biology as well as some tips and tricks to the content. Guys, we would really appreciate it if you all could subscribe and like our videos, because growing in subscribers will help us grow our channel and post more videos more frequently. So anyways, without further ado, let's get started with some bio. So the second unit of AP Biology covers the basic tour of the cell. In this unit, you're going to learn how to identify each and every part of the cell, the function of each part, and how it contributes to the function of the body. So to begin, let me ask you guys a simple question. What is a cell? Well, the plain and simple answer to that would be the basic building block of life. Us humans, and all the other animals on this planet, are mostly made up of multiple cells, and this means that we are multicellular organisms. However, although we do refer to the cell as the building block of life, there are small parts inside of the cell that help the cell get its name. To visualize, we can imagine an atom. While it is the building block of matter, the parts of the atom, which consist of protons, neutrons, and electrons, inside make it what it is. As you can see in this diagram, the protons, neutrons, and electrons are very crucial to the function of the atom. And just like this, inside of a cell, there are small subparts called organelles. So the first organelle that we're going to be talking about is the nucleus. So the nucleus is located right here. And essentially what the nucleus is the nucleus is a membrane-bound spherical organelle that contains the DNA inside of a cell. So right here, the DNA is kept inside the nucleus and it's arranged in a loosely related fiber structure called chromatin. So inside here, you're going to see chromatin. Now, this small spherical structure marked by a 1 is called the nucleolus. And what the nucleolus does is that the nucleolus produces ribosomes, which we're going to be talking about later in the video. Now, another thing to note about the nucleus is that it's basically semi-permeable because on its membrane, so as you can see right here, marked by these dots, so the nucleus has these small pores on its outside membrane, which means that many things can enter and exit the nucleus, which means that it has a semi-permeable membrane. So next, we're going to be talking about the endomembrane system. So basically, the endomembrane system consists of a couple of different organelles. So in the endomembrane system, we have the endoplasmic reticulum right here, which can either come in smooth or rough. We have the Golgi apparatus right here. Then we also have vesicles, which are small transportation organelles. And so these are the organelles that make up the endomembrane system. So first I'm going to talk about their individual jobs, and then we'll talk about how they combine to form the endomembrane system. So let's begin with the endoplasmic reticulum. So basically, as I said before, the endoplasmic reticulum comes in smooth and rough. And so let's start with smooth. So essentially, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is marked by number 8 right here. So we're going to call that smooth ER. And so what it basically does is that it synthesizes lipids, one of the main macromolecules. It metabolizes carbohydrates, detoxification of drugs, and it stores calcium ions. So essentially, that's the job of the smooth ER. Now, let's take a look at the rough ER, which is located actually right here with the number 5. So as you can see, the rough ER is called rough because of these small dots on it. And in fact, these dots are actually ribosomes. So the ribosomes are the things that make it look rough. Now, what does the rough ER do? Essentially, as you know, since there are ribosomes on the rough ER, we can already know that the rough ER is responsible for some degree of protein synthesis. And in addition, it also contains glycoprotein. Alright, next let's look at vesicles. So as you can see, these small green looking things, these are vesicles. So let's write that down. Alright, so vesicles, their main job is essentially transportation. So basically, a vesicle is kind of like a membrane-bound organelle, which can actually engulf molecules and proteins and actually transport them through different parts of the cell, maybe through the outside of the cell, or it can even transport cells from one cell to another cell. Alright, so the last main part of the endomembrane system is the Golgi apparatus. So right here, marked with 6, these big red poles is the Golgi apparatus. So let's write that down. Alright, so the Golgi apparatus, what does it do? Essentially, its job is packaging. So So it packages proteins, lipids, anything that needs to leave the cell or go to a different part of the cell. And the way it does that is it actually uses vesicles. So as I said before, vesicles are able to engulf things, right? So what vesicles do is that they use something called phagocytosis, which means engulfing a molecule or a protein or a lipid. So using this technique, as I discussed before, the vesicle from the Golgi apparatus is able to, transport anything out of the cell or inside the cell or throughout the cell. Now finally, let's talk about how the endomembrane system comes together. So let's use a protein as an example. So the DNA is transferred from the nucleus to the ribosomes that sit on the rough ER. So what the rough ER does is, right, since it has ribosomes, it synthesizes proteins. And so now where does the protein go? So from the rough ER, the protein actually goes through a vesicle, as I'm marking right over here. It goes through a vesicle, and the vesicle transports it throughout the cell all the way till the Golgi apparatus. So the protein ends up in the Golgi apparatus. Now at the Golgi apparatus actually packages the protein into another vesicle so that it can be taken out of the cell through the process of phagocytosis, right? And so now once that is done, the vesicle is actually going to transport itself out of the cell through the semi-permeable membrane, and the protein will either end up in a different cell or it may come back through the same cell, but essentially it's just getting transported. So the endomembrane system at the end is just a system of transportation. Let's talk about lysosomes. So basically lysosomes, as you can see here, this is a lysosome. So lysosomes, what they do is lysosomes actually break down and they do most of the metabolic processes in cells. So basically, whenever something comes into the cell, like let's say a fat or lipids, actually the lysosomes are the organelle that breaks it down. So it does part of the metabolic processes along with the mitochondria that does cellular respiration, one of the main metabolic processes. But the lysosome is a separate organelle which actually breaks down things that come into the cell. So it's the main job and is just breaking down. And after this, another organelle that we're going to talk about right now is called the vacuole. So as you can see, marked number 10. So what the vacuole is the vacuole is just a storage. The vacuole actually just stores extra macronutrients, micronutrients, and anything that the cell needs for energy. And yeah, it just stores things that the cell needs later on, which it's gonna use. So basically, what's the difference between plants and animals? There's actually a very big difference. Essentially, in plants, the vacuole is actually very large and it's called the central vacuole. This is because the plant needs a lot of water, energy, and food that it needs to store in the vacuole. But for humans, since we are heterotrophs and we actually consume food, we don't need to store all that at one place because we have it readily available to us. So that's the reason that our vacuoles differ from plants. So the next two organelles that we're going to be talking about make up the main metabolic processes of the cell. So specifically, we're talking about the mitochondria and chloroplast. So to begin with, let's start with the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is actually right over here, marked with a 9. So this is the mitochondria. So essentially, the mitochondria is responsible for cellular respiration. So it's the process by which the cell takes up sugars and fats and converts them into ATP, which is a usable form of energy for the cell. Essentially, the mitochondria is a really important organelle because ATP is necessary for many of the cellular functions that the cell needs to survive and do other things such as protein synthesis. So that's why. So the mitochondria's main job is to produce ATP. So now let's discuss the makeup of the mitochondria. So essentially, the mitochondria is made up of a couple of different parts. So let's take a look at a mitochondria diagram. So right here is the basic image of a mitochondria. So there's a couple of different parts here, as I said. So to begin with, let's discuss that the mitochondria is actually a double membrane. So as you can see, there's this outer membrane that I'm marking with this brown. It's the outer membrane. And the inner membrane is actually marked with right here, like the space between, as you can see right over here, right over here, and right over here. That's the inner membrane. Okay. So basically that means that the mitochondria is double membrane. Now moving on into the mitochondria, we see the first thing that we see is this space between the membranes. So right over here, these long spaces. So this is actually called the cristae, okay? The cristae is the space between the two membranes, and essentially, the cristae is actually where the electron transport chain of cellular respiration takes place. And you don't really need to know much about that for now, because we're going to get into that detailed in another video. For now, just know what it is and where it is. So next, we're going to be talking about this large space in between the mitochondria, which is big blue space that's seen in many different parts. And so this is going to be called the matrix. So the matrix is where the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle takes place in cellular respiration. And finally, looking back at the inner membrane is where actually the oxidative phosphorylation takes place, which is the last step of cellular respiration and the main producer of ATP. Now let's talk about the chloroplast. The chloroplast is an organelle that's only found in plant cells, and just like the mitochondria, is responsible for one of the main metabolic functions of the cell. So the chloroplast actually is taking part in photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is the process by which plant cells are able to make food for the plant using sunlight. Essentially, now let's talk about the parts. So as you can see here, the chloroplast is made up of a couple of different parts. So just to begin, we can already see that just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast has a double membrane. So here, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. And in the middle of those two is the intermembrane space, which is located right along here. So now moving on, let's look at the inside of the chloroplast. So the first thing we see is this green stack right here. So the green stack is called a granum, and it's actually a stack of green pieces called thylakoids, which look like little coins. And thylakoids are responsible for the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. And basically, after light-dependent reactions, the light-independent reactions actually take place in the fluid that surrounds the granums. So this place, and you can see it's called the stroma, and it's an aqueous fluid, and this is where the light-independent reactions take place, or the Calvin cycle. So essentially, these are the parts of the chloroplast. So basically, one big thing believed about the mitochondria and the chloroplast is that they were actually one of the huge reasons that eukaryotic cells exist today, and that's because of the endosymbiotic theory. So essentially what the theory states is that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once prokaryotic cells, and they used to live on their own, so they were once prokaryotic. And so basically the implication of that is that once, while they were prokaryotic, there were other cells which had a symbiotic relationship with these mitochondria and chloroplast, which in the end turned into eukaryotic cells that we know today. This is a very widely accepted theory, and there's many evidences to back this up. And most of these evidences we're going to talk about in the video about cell respiration and photosynthesis, and not get into much of it now, because right now it's just basically an introduction of the cell theory. So for now, just know that the endosymbiotic theory just basically means that eukaryotic cells came from a symbiotic relationship between different types of organelles, and in this case especially the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. Now guys, let's get to talking about the cytoskeleton and the makeup of the cell. So essentially, when we talk about the cytoskeleton and the structure of the cell, the main two components are the cytoskeleton itself and the motor proteins, which allow for cell motility. Essentially what that means is that how the cell moves and how the structure contributes to its movement. So first, when we look at the cytoskeleton, we can see in this diagram here that the cytoskeleton is made up of many different parts. Now we're going to get into those parts real soon, but first let's talk about motor proteins. So essentially, motor proteins contribute to the movement of the cell. And we're not going to get into too much of their structure, but basically motor proteins help organelles in different parts of the cell move along different tracks so that the cell can move as a whole and carry out different types of functions in different orientations. Now, looking at the cytoskeleton, we actually see three different parts that make it up. So the three parts are the intermediate filaments, microtubules, and the microfilaments. First, let's talk about microtubules. So when you look at this diagram, you can see that microtubules are labeled right over here, and they're pointing to these large golden shaped rods. So basically, what a microtubule is, it's a hollow rod constructed from globular proteins. And how this aids in motility is that microtubules actually serve as tracks for the organelles to move. And this is all done because microtubules have an abundance of motor proteins on them that help them carry out this function. The next one that we're going to be talking about is the microfilaments. So essentially, microfilaments are right here labeled, and if you look, they're these small golden rods at the top and bottom of the cell. So essentially, what are microfilaments? They are thin and solid rods. Additionally, they're also called actin filaments because they're mostly made up from a globular protein called actin. So a microfilament is a twisted chain of actin subunits. And so what role does microfilaments play? It's there to bear tension. So while the cell is stretching and getting into different formations, the microfilaments as part of the cytoskeleton are actually supporting the cell and helping it bear tension even if the cell pulls apart, so that the cell will never come apart. There's many different microfilaments as part of the cytoskeleton, although in this diagram you can only see one. But actually, all these different microfilaments inside the plasma membrane help support the cell's shape and allow it to go to different orientations without having any structural problems. Finally, let's take a look at intermediate filaments. So intermediate filaments are labeled right here. And actually, as you can see in this diagram, there are these thin, elongated fibers. And the cool thing about intermediate filaments is that, as you can see in the diagram, they make up most of the structural support. Because imagine looking at this diagram, if there were no intermediate filaments, the whole cell would just collapse on itself. So this is why intermediate filaments are one of the most important parts of the cytoskeleton. Essentially, another thing about intermediate filaments is that they are very permanent. So while microtubules and microfilaments usually after the cell death get metabolized, the intermediate filaments actually stay. And a vivid example of this is actually seen in skin cells. So if you imagine your skin cells, they're full of keratin filaments. And so each cell is made up of a bunch of intermediate filaments that are especially sturdy and play a really big role in reinforcing the shape of a cell and fixing the positions of different organelles as part of the cell, which in turn makes the skin really strong and robust. This video's final topic is going to be what's outside of the cell. So essentially talking about cell walls, the cellular membrane, and extracellular matrix in animal cells. So first, let's start with the cell wall. So here in this diagram is a cell wall. So as you can see, the cell wall is made up of a couple of different parts. And the cell wall is actually made up of a carbohydrate called cellulose. And essentially, let's look at the parts of the cell wall. So first, when we look at this diagram, we see that there's three main parts on the left. The middle lamella, primary cell wall, and then the plasma membrane, which is the cell membrane. So the middle lamella is actually a soft structure that is between different cells in a plant. And essentially, what the middle lamella does is that it glues adjacent cells together to make the plant in total more robust. And the primary cell wall, which sits right below it, is a thin and flexible wall. However, some plant cells, which need extra protection, add a secondary cell wall right about here. And although not all cells have it, the cells that have it actually need a stronger protection. For example, an example is wood, which consists mainly of secondary walls that makes it really robust. Now let's talk about the cell membrane. So, as you can see in this diagram, the cell membrane is made up of many different parts. However, for this video, we're only going to be talking about a few of the most essential parts, because some of these parts are going to be discussed in the cell-to-cell contact or cell signaling video. So let's get started. So the first part and the most important part that you're going to want to know is right here, this middle part. And what the interesting thing about this middle part is that it's made up of phospholipids. All right. So this middle part, as you can see, the outside is made up of these heads and the inside are made up of these tails. So basically, how a phospholipid looks is kind of like this. It looks like a balloon. And the outside is actually the hydrophilic head, meaning that it is more attracted to water, and the inside is hydrophobic, meaning it's nonpolar and cannot take in molecules that are polar or really big. So the reason they call the cellular membrane semi-permeable is that molecules actually that are non-polar and small can diffuse across it freely. But molecules that are polar or large actually need proteins like these, transport proteins, outside to help them actually come in. So basically, that aids in diffusion. And so these are the main parts that you're going to want to know for today. And that you're going to want to know that it's made up of phospholipids and the actual makeup of phospholipid, including the hydrophobic and the hydrophilic heads. So hydrophobic, and the tail is phobic. Now looking at the extracellular matrix, we can see that the ECM is made up of mostly collagen, and collagen is right out here. So basically what collagen is it's a very abundant glycoprotein in the ECM of most animal cells, and it's very tight and robust fiber, which forms strong and tight relationships. So basically, other parts of the extracellular matrix include fibroconnectins and integrins. So fibroconnectins are actually fibers that connect different ECMs together that give two different cells a bond and keeps them together. And this is actually really common in the human body, because in many different parts of your body, many of these cells are connected together. Then we look at integrins, right? So integrins are built into the plasma membrane, and they actually serve as transport proteins to help things come inside and outside of the cell. And that's it for the extracellular matrix, and that's it for our organelle review for today. Hey guys, I'm sorry this video was so long, but if you watch this video, it's going to save you a lot of time in studying for your test, because this video has super detailed descriptions of each and every organelle, which is going to help you be really prepared for your test in this unit or for the AP test that you're studying for in the future. But anyways, thanks guys for watching this video. Make sure to stay tuned for our next video on Unit 2, which is going to sum up this unit by talking about cell signaling. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and we hope that you're going to be back on our channel for more videos like these. And make sure to check out our other series on this channel too, such as AP World, AP Computer Science, and AP Spanish. And please make sure to like and subscribe. Guys, the more you like and the more subscribers we get, the more motivated we're going to be to make more videos. And we would really appreciate it if you guys could just hit that subscribe button and like this video. And I'll make sure to see you guys next time for more videos like this. Thanks guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.